Here's today's First Word Daily Devotion.
It's May the 8th, and let's turn our attention on today's reading to Ruth chapter 1. And look at the setting here. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. Now, flip over to verse 22 of Ruth chapter 1. Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So if you remember the way that we closed the book of Judges closed by emphasizing Bethlehem. And here, Bethlehem becomes entirely significant because, of course, it's the house of David, as well as it's the house where Jesus was born. And so Bethlehem closes the book of Judges, and Bethlehem comes entirely significant for our reading. So in the days of Judges, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem of Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi. The names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her two sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And from there the story ensues. Of course, they lived there about 10 years, and then not only does Elimelech die, but his two sons die. And so here is Naomi left with her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. And look at the difference here that we have. Verse 14, then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For wherever you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. And the two of them went on until they came, look at this, to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, is this Naomi? And she said, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So it looks like we're entering the same period in Judges, doesn't it? Where, remember, we closed Judges, there was a lot of weeping, and here we see a lot of weeping. Death and sort of sin is this fragmentation grenade that has blown up, and the fragments of that explosion on that day in the garden continue and persist, and we see that in the story of Ruth and Naomi. It's really a sad story, but as we're going to see as we read the narrative, the Lord takes this sad story and weaves a tapestry of His loving kindness. And that's really a key theme in the book of Ruth. So as we're reading the book of Ruth, we'll have to pay attention to that word, loving kindness or steadfast love. And so let's turn our attention to John chapter 12, verses 20 through 50. Now among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. And I remember this verse in particular because when I was at First Baptist Atlanta, I had the privilege of being influenced by a Florida pastor by the name of Scott Downing. And if I'm telling this story right, Scott, if you're listening, you'll have to write me and tell me whether or not I remember this. But he had this verse attached to his pulpit, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. And he remembered to teach me very early on, whenever I preach, stand behind that pulpit, stand behind that cross, and determine to let others see Jesus and not necessarily me. And so I appreciate that when I read this verse. Now, look at verse 27. Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I have come to this hour. So here is this dynamic that Jesus says, save me from, but at the also this hour, even though it's to be in some cases resisted, this hour is the reason for Jesus' coming. Now look at verse 31. Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And look at this phrase here, verse 32. And when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. Now, what's this lifting up that he's talking about? Of course, there are many movements of Jesus being lifted up. Not only do we have him being lifted up on the cross, we have him being lifted out and up from the grave, as well as we have him being lifted up in the ascension. Well, what's he talking about here? Verse 33. He said this to show by what, look at the language, what kind of death he was going to die. So there's a particular kind of death that he dies. It's a death where he is lifted up. And so the lifting up and the drawing through Christ is referring to his death. And that's important for us. It's not necessarily so much the cross as it is the kind of death. And remember, the kind of death that Jesus dies is, of course, a death of crucifixion. But it's not just a death of crucifixion. It's a death of substitution. It's a death of atonement. It's a death of reconciliation and forgiveness. It's a death of judgment. It's a death in wrath. It's a death that brings about our salvation. Now, speaking of which, Jesus being lifted up is the way that we are to understand Jesus. And look at this passage here that Jesus quotes here in John chapter 12 and verse 40. He quotes Isaiah, but look at verse 41. I want you to see this nugget, especially as we're reading the Old Testament. Pay attention to the way that Jesus reads the Bible. Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. Truly, every page whispers the name of Jesus Christ. Remember that as we're reading the Bible. Always have before us the reality of this Jesus who has been lifted up so that he can draw all people to himself.